Welcome to this week's episode of Digital Diary. On this episode, we're going to talk about modern quilts and how to actually deal with them. I know I deal with modern quilts day in and day out, but not everyone does. And I know sometimes when they walk in the door, you might not know necessarily how to handle them. So, our instructors and educators today have put together some of the modern quilts that they've handled, and we're going to talk about choosing patterns for modern quilts and what a modern quilt really is, as well as some techniques and tools to how to handle some of those, because modern quilts are not necessarily, blocks and borders and sashings, and so there's some things we have to think of when we go to deal with a modern quilt. So let's go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to talk a little bit about what a modern quilt is to start with.
I think that's good because just the definition of what is a modern quilt is hard for some of us. Mm-hmm. I'm a traditionalist, I guess.
Okay. So what is a modern quilt? This is one of mine, and we don't have to really talk about this quilt in particular, but we'll get there. Okay, so what is modern? So first, a modern quilt is meant to be a functional quilt. So this is what basically distinguishes it from like an art quilt. So art quilts sometimes use different materials and techniques that may not necessarily make it through a washing machine. Typically, modern quilts are meant to be used and washed and loved from the beginning.
That is interesting because I thought a lot of wall hangings were modern quilts.
A lot of times they are modern design inspired, which is our next topic.
Okay.
Right? And so when we have something that is focused on kind of that modern design element, then that can be considered a modern quilt as well, which a lot of those wall hangings you're talking about are probably modern, technically modern quilts, but typically it's a functional quilt. Usually we're seeing lots of bold colors, sometimes lots of crazy prints that you're not necessarily used to seeing in other quilts. A lot of times we'll put them together. And we also have high contrast and graphic areas of solid color. And a lot of times those solid fabrics show every single stitch, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? It gives us a lot of space to show off our quilting skills, but it gives us a lot of space to show off our quilting skills, right? So it's kind of scary, but it's a great opportunity. So another hallmark of a modern quilt is a lot of improvisational piecing. So they're not necessarily following a pattern, they're just piecing together lots of fabric, right? And a lot of times, people think improv is, crazy and all over the place, but a lot of good improv actually follows certain rules. It's just different for each quilt. But in terms of digital quilting, it's really hard to come up with a pattern that's going to fit something that was improvisationally pieced, right? Because it's not going to fit a traditional block design. Okay, the concept of minimalism. So a lot of modern quilts have this aspect where there's not a whole lot of piecing going on, right? You might have one or two main elements and that's it. The rest is just plain fabric. And so taking that into account when we go to quilt it, we always have to think of how to deal with it. So taking that another step further, we usually have expansive negative space. And people are always kind of confused about the negative space term. But basically it's the pieces of background fabric that are not the main pieced elements, right? And a lot of times there's big chunks of solid fabric that hasn't been pieced at all. And so those are those areas of negative space that we usually try to accentuate with our quilting.
So an example of that would be like the black fabric in Jeanna's quilt, the one behind Jeanna, right?
Right, right. And I have a couple examples of that in the follow-up slides. So the other thing that we see a lot is alternative grid work. So basically, these quilts don't follow your typical block border sashing, 3 rows, 4 columns, that sort of thing, right? And so because of that, we might have to find ways to use our digital quilting patterns in different ways in order to fit whatever blocks there might be, right?
So is that like wavy lines as opposed to straight lines? I'm thinking grid as in a traditional crosshatch grid. Or are you talking piecing?
I'm talking the actual piecing itself. Okay, so when we think of alternative grid work, it's more not necessarily it's more the layout of the quilt, like where the blocks are actually placed in the quilt, right? So it's not your traditional block sashings border. It's a couple of blocks on one side of the quilt and a couple of, and nothing on the other side. Does that make sense? So another aspect that you'll see a lot is that modern traditional aspect, which basically means we're taking more of a traditional style quilt, but giving it a modern treatment, right? And so a lot of times we're looking for specific patterns as a digital quilter to put on those quilts to make it more modern instead of going and taking that quilt to be more traditional. So to lead into that, Karen, you've given us a couple of examples of a lot of patterns that you've designed, right? And these are all examples of good modern designs?
Well, I hope they're good examples. I'm not a modern, sorry, you'll have to cut that out. Oh my gosh. I'm not an expert on modern designs per se. I love the style and I'm a fan for sure, but I don't get a lot of modern quilts into my shop, and I haven't had time to make many modern quilts of my own, but I do a lot of design work and I do like to try to make more modern designs. So hopefully these kind of fit the bill. What I do get is my customers bring a quilt in and they say, like this one behind me, and it's fairly traditional. But they'll say, I want something modern on it. And so it's the quilting pattern. That's where I get to try to choose something that is modern styled.
I love some of these designs. I can see right now where I've had quilts where some of these would look great.
Well, and a lot of things that I'm also realizing is a lot of the modern designs are probably considered fairly masculine designs as well, just because they typically don't have lots of, feathers and flowers and those sort of floofy kind of elements. The other thing I'm noticing, Karen, is there's some big, wide designs that are not, simple little repeat designs. You want to talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, those bottom 3, those are pretty popular designs on my website, I have to admit. The designs that will stitch across an entire quilt and come back. I call them over and back designs. So they stitch across and come back. They cover the entire quilt. Like you said, there's not like a static repeat. There's not a repeat that you can find necessarily.
We just have rows, not repeats. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, and those are pretty popular.
And when you go to stitch those out, are there any considerations that we have to think about? I know when I go to stitch some of those designs out, I typically slow my machine down just because when you're going all the way across the quilts, it just helps a little bit to go a little bit slower. Any tips and tricks from the rest of you for those types of designs?
Well, I found with larger quilts, the ones that deeply nest, if you do have shrinkage, that you sometimes have to go up to the take-up bar and tug that quilt back out in order to make the deep nest fit on the next row. And that's only after you've advanced. I do have some issues with straight lines, and again, I do have 5 machines, and I have one machine I just don't run straight line quilts on. And
It
I
just
think
doesn't like it. The tension
it
isn't
doesn't,
balanced enough, or
it just doesn't like it, but I've been told that that can be changed. Well, my workaround is go to another machine. But
I think usually the workaround is to
fix
toggle
it.
and play with your tension until you can balance it just
Yeah.
right.
But I bet we have some listeners too, some people watching that they also want to work around instead of playing with their machine's mechanics. And if you choose the right design, you might not have that issue as well. Like the bottom one on this picture, it stitches straight across and then straight back. And you're going to be more prone to have tension issues or thread breakage because it just goes straight back to the left. Where the top design, which is actually the one I used on this quilt, it does stitch to the right, but then when it's coming back left, it's making those nice arcs. So it doesn't have a nice long straight line, and you're not going to have any issues stitching that over and back, over and back.
Yeah, that works very well. It's the straight line. And if you can have some kind of movement going from right to left and keep your straight lines from left to right, that's a great workaround. It's a design choice.
Well, and I've also been known, if I really, really want to use a design and I'm having thread breaks, I'll go into the pattern and divide it up and make everything go right to left anyway, or left to right. Yeah.
Yep.
That does work.
But doesn't it also help?
It's an
to,
extreme workaround.
turn
I
your
wouldn't
needle?
recommend it. Okay, so here is a close-up of that quilt that's behind Karen, and you can see how pretty that design stitches out. I love it.
So what color thread did you use on this? Thread choice in
You know what?
modern.
I'm a
is
blender. That's a great topic to talk about thread choice, but I am a blender. So 99% of the time, I'm going to use something that's going to blend. So I used the cream, the off-white.
Yeah.
Well,
I fear not the thread. I'm more of a bold thread person.
and typically on a modern quilt, you don't necessarily want the thread to be completely in your face. Sometimes you do, it depends. But I usually like a finer thread if I'm going to do blending work like this.
I agree with the finer thread.
Okay. Paige, you want to tell us a little bit about this one?
Okay, so I am a traditionalist, and I'm thinking black border sashings. When I get a quilt that I think is modern, it's usually got that open area. So I'm trying
space.
Negative space. Yes, I need the right term. So I need something that fits there. And what I will do traditionally for myself is I will build out from what is already there. I'm not thinking in terms of putting something else out there that doesn't have anything to do with what is already there. And that might be some thinking I need to reverse. So here I built the blocks and I did the pattern work for all of these things around what was there. And this is a very light teal thread. It is not a blending gray. But I mean, I say fear not the thread, but I it's not blazing teal.
I love how you've broken up that negative space and given yourself a lot of areas to tackle that are smaller and more manageable, because I think a lot of times when you get that huge expansive negative space, just being able to tackle it as one piece is not a viable option.
Well, one of my ideas was to run some lines that echoed these spaces on a vertical. Well, that was going to be a problem because of my throat space. I did think about loading this thing at an angle, and I decided against it.
A lot of times I load my modern quilts sideways because I'm doing interesting things with them. So loading a quilt in a different manner than just straight up and down can give you more options as well.
Well, I love how you've broken up the space on this one, the negative space, and then you had the opportunity to put different styles of designs in the different spaces, and I think it just adds so much interest to the quilt.
Well,
The
thank you.
quilting makes the quilt.
Yes, it does. And I took my elements from the fabric. So if it was in the fabric somewhere, I was repeating it. There's a lot of circles and straight lines.
So the blocks that are up against your pieced blocks, the spaces that are kind of T-shaped, they look empty from here, from the picture. Are they empty, or are they
No, they are quilted flat. That is matchstick. I didn't know it was called matchstick when I first started doing this. It is just like an 1/8 of an inch piano key. And I just drew it on the grid and then squished it down so it wasn't 1/4 of an inch, it was an 1/8 of an inch. And so these patterns I did make in Creative Studio. These could so totally be done on an Elevate.
I love how it looks empty because it really highlights the pieced blocks by putting something that's not going to fight with those pieced fabrics.
Yeah, it's a total negative. It's very flat. And one of my design concepts that I live with is what is down is taken back and what is up is noticed. So if I don't want something noticed, I take it back. Quilt it flat.
Well, and you also brought up another good choice, because a lot of modern designs quilting designs tend to be fairly dense. And it's hard sometimes because we only can go down to like that 1/4 inch grid in Creative Studio, that creating a design at that scale can sometimes be difficult. But a lot of times I'll, like you said, build it on a bigger grid and then use the handles or the spacing to shrink it.
That's exactly what I did.
I think it's really interesting with the matchsticking. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see the seams in the T area. But on the right, where the matchsticking is, you can't see those seam lines. That really is.
It just makes them go away.
Yeah, I didn't pay any attention to the seams at all.
That's awesome.
Okay. So here's another one. And this is another example of very much a modern traditional alternative grid. We only have the one row on the quilt, right? And how did you handle it, Paige?
Well, this one was more of a challenge, and I really had fun with it. I wanted to make the snowflakes go across the quilt, and all I could think of is this looked like one of those Norwegian knitted sweaters.
Absolutely.
And I love that idea. So I wanted to replicate it. And I did use a chalk liner and my piece of grid to draw the lines out, because those lines are way larger than the bed of my machine.
Absolutely.
And then once I divided the spaces, I could fill in each one. And I like your term modern traditionalist. Is that what someone had said? Because I think that's what I am. I have a hard time breaking out of the traditional, the block. It's just I recreated the block and made it smaller.
And it was perfect. I love it.
Put them together. And there's a lot of very quilted down negative space, and that's behind those snowflakes.
It makes them pop. Mm-hmm. And again, you're taking that negative space and dividing it up into smaller, more workable elements. So it works very well.
And it was really easy to replicate that snowflake, because those snowflakes are built on a 1-inch grid. So I just recreated a pattern on a 1-inch grid and then shrank it down.
Awesome. Okay, Paige, you want to talk about this one a little?
Okay, so this is really what I consider modern, and it was something that I had some difficulty with.
And
And
this
I
is
actually,
all improvisationally pieced, right?
oh yeah, there's no straight lines. Even the straight lines aren't really straight.
So you
And I
couldn't
did have to
create
call,
just a block pattern to quilt over the top.
no, I had to call Christine and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking. Is this okay? And she gave me the go ahead, so I did. What I did really was I took a line, like a curve line, and I yeah, right around there, and then I echoed. And there were times when I'd have to go a long ways to get that echo, to get that next space, and then I did fills in between. And even when it looks like it's crossing over seam lines and the line is still going, many times I had to end that echo at that seam line because I couldn't go any further on the bed of the machine.
Yep.
And then the other thing I did, the only shape I could find to replicate in here was the circles that were in the pattern, and there was that Greek key in one of the fabrics. So I took the Greek key, I shrank it down, and then I echoed one of the lines, like that green line, and then I applied the Greek key to that line. And I left some of the echo lines there, and that kind of is what giving me the channel.
I love your work on this one. It works so well. But it does demonstrate a lot of the issues that we have with modern quilts, of how do we, deal with all of that improv work with lots of, space that's not standard blocks, Okay, let's change things up a little. Deann, I think this is one of yours, right?
It is.
You want to tell us how you tackled it?
Well, each one of those triangles is 3-dimensional.
Wow.
And she wanted something a little bit modern, which is very unusual for her. So I didn't want to go overboard on the modern. So what I did is I took some border patterns and
Great
shrunk
idea.
them down so that I could have in all the places that are going straight across, those are all border patterns. And then around the quilt, around the triangles is a point-to-point triangle pattern. And then a very modern border in those long black lines. And of course I loaded it sideways so I could.
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah. But it was not a large quilt. It was more of a lap size quilt. So I was able to have enough throat space for the wider triangle blocks. But
I
it
love
was
this one.
fun.
Yeah.
And I definitely undercharged her for the amount of work I did.
But I bet you learned a whole bunch on it.
I did, and it was fun. It was fun.
Yeah, that's a lot of dense quilting. That took a while.
Jeanna, you want to talk about this one a little?
Ooh, I like it.
This was a real fun quilt. One of my customers in San Antonio brought me this quilt, and something about those circles just really got me excited about this one. And so, and I'm not traditionally a modern quilter, but I love doing them. But I tried to turn this into some borders around and treat it like sashings and borders around. And then I hand drove the machine around those spirals.
It's a great combination effect. And I love the use of all the borders and corners and how they blend to make it a different design.
That one was a lot of fun.
I love this quilt.
And again, you're going to see a lot of the stitching on these modern quilts because they use solid fabrics a lot. So you're going to see a lot of that stitching. Oh, now we get to talk a little bit about my quilts. So this is kind of a close-up of matchsticking across the entire quilt. So Paige was talking a little bit about matchsticking before. A lot of times, just putting straight lines across the entire quilt top is the right call as well. And so in this case, I just use my channel locks and drag the machine across multiple times. And you can tell I changed up the thread quite a bit. So I
was going to ask about that. I love that.
I think I used at least, 12 to 15 different threads, different colors, different weights, different textures, shiny, matte, thick, thin, just so it gives you a little bit of a change in texture as we go across.
And is your spacing all random?
I just, used my channel locks and randomly picked a spot to go all the way across the quilts. So when I'm doing this type of quilting, typically I don't completely load the quilts all the way in, and I really like my quilt clips to keep everything straight and even, because you are going to get a lot of shrinkage with this, right? You can't avoid it. And typically when I go to lay in those lines, I'll start at like 2 or 3 inches apart and then go back and fill in the spaces in between until I get something that's dense enough.
That was going to be my next question.
But because I can use those channel locks to go across the entire quilt, I've done some fairly large, 100+ wide quilts with my channel locks, and I can still keep it fairly even. The big thing is when I go to roll these quilts, that everything stays fairly square and even again, because when you go to put that next line in after you roll, it might have shifted just a little just because of how you rolled the quilt. So that's the one thing you have to be aware of. So here's a couple of mine where I've taken some of that negative space and used different strategies to break it up into more usable and workable sections. Like Paige was doing on those that she had all that big, expansive negative space. I do it even when I have just a little bit of negative space, just as a design choice. Because I'm working with a lot of solid fabrics usually, I'll find a way to create a major quilting design element to break up that space so that I can treat sections that are smaller at the time, and I'm not having to quilt half the quilt at one time. Okay, so here's another thing, another quilt. So this is an example of minimalism where there's not a whole lot going on this quilt. There's a lot of negative space, and so I wanted very simple quilting choices for this quilt to enhance that minimalism. If I had gone and put feathers and flowers and stuff all over this quilt, it would not give you the same look, right? It wouldn't give you the same feel. And so the big thing that I did here is I created these ghosted in elements where I put some quilted elements in that I treated exactly the same as the piecing, just in different areas. And again, thread choice, right? You can see those ghosted in ones because I quilted them with pink thread. And yeah, I did diagonal lines across the background on this quilt. We're not going to talk too much about how I did that, but there were a couple of lines that I had to stop and start. It's not a good idea unless you're doing it for a specific reason. And I didn't load it sideways. I did not do that.
I love seeing everybody's quilts.
I know, they're so
It's like
great.
show and tell. I love the pictures.
I want to make a modern quilt now.
Yay!
Maybe just a whole cloth even.
Absolutely.
Can a whole cloth be a modern quilt?
Absolutely.
Yay, okay. I can do it.
No, a lot of it has to do with the design, and you, Karen, are all about that design, so we're good to go there. And a lot of it is just, again, finding ways to break up all that negative space and use the tools that you already know how to use, right? I know I have a class out there on Camel Education that's specifically about how to deal with these modern quilts. And we have lots of other opportunities to learn different tools and techniques to use our digital quilting designs on some of these modern quilts. And it's more about how you use your patterns and not necessarily what patterns you choose. So, any of you have any more insights on modern quilts before we go?
Well, I just wanted to say that before we kind of started, I was a little worried that I didn't know the definition of modern quilts, but I like to know now that there's a little bit of there's some interpretation there that can be made. So I mean, is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's
kind of told us
right.
the rules and things, but if we feel like it works, right?
Absolutely. Well, and a lot of people, like I said, most of them don't have modern quilts coming in all the time. That's typically what I have. But when you get, you know, a couple of quilts a year that walk in, you don't want them to throw you. You want to be able to have those tools in your bag that you know how to handle them.
Yeah, like modern is a niche for you. And I'm pretty much across the board, everything. And so I feel this is an area that I would like to do more with. And I have reverted back to what Karen does with an overall that is a modern design. And that seems to work for me.
Well, and even when we go to choose those overall designs, just kind of knowing what to look for. A lot of the straight lines and geometrics, kind of staying away from, you know, flowery and feathery types. I have been known to put a feather on a modern quilt, but I was specifically asked to do so. Okay, so with that, I think we'll wrap it up. So thanks everyone for joining us for another episode of Digital Diary, Adventures of a Modern Quilter. And remember to go out there to Camel Education and get all of those educational opportunities, as well as opportunities for an educator consult with any one of us. We'll see you again.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.